BioPic. But before I even get into that, I want to say Happy Father's Day as well. I make a lot of jokes. I am incredibly sarcastic. But my dad died when I was 8 years old. And I had a great father up until 8. And then from 8 years old until today, God has brought men into my path that have loved and cared for me. So for you men that work next door with the kids, right, the elementary students, or even in the nursery, or the men that come in here on Sunday afternoons for middle school and high school youth group, thank you for investing. Because frankly, some of our teens don't have dads, and you're making a great impact. So happy Father's Day. We are in week 3. Week 3 of BioPic. And BioPic, right, is the idea of a documentary that tells somebody's story. And I told second service last week, and I left you guys out, that I like watching documentaries and so forth, and I want this recorded. My wife loves watching documentaries, mostly about those women who kill their husbands. And I've told my children repeatedly, if I die before their mother and it looks even a little bit questionable, they need to get an autopsy. Actually, even if it doesn't look questionable, spring for the autopsy. You'll get a better inheritance that way. And now it's recorded, so the FBI will be able to look into it as well. We are in week 3 of BioPic, and the idea behind BioPic is it's looking into the scriptures and looking at the stories that are there. And the idea of the scriptures that exist for our good, for us to learn from. And also, you know, if you're sitting here, you're skeptical, that's awesome. You don't know if all of this is true, that's great. We're glad you're here. We want you to keep coming back as long as you can, because eventually, hopefully, obviously, we exist to change you from a skeptic to a believer. And but you are welcome to be a skeptic here as long as you would like to be. And then there's others of us in the room that, right, maybe you grew up in church and you've heard these stories time and time again, and they kind of just turn into, I don't know, a figment of your memory, not something that changes, right? Not something that you look at and it changes who you are. It motivates you to do something different. And our hope for you as well as we go through this series, you are reminded of what God has done and what you can learn from and what we can apply to our lives. And also the reminder, I use the terminology of these are stories, and we are talking about characters in the stories. That doesn't make it fiction, doesn't make it folklore. I personally believe this all to be 100% true historical Hebrew history and factual historical Hebrew history. And if, in the same sense that George Washington crossing the Delaware is a story, and good old George, President Washington, was a character in that story. It's a factual story that I also believe really happened. So as you sit there and as I talk, please don't think story and characters makes this any less true. So as we go through this series, right, there's some underlying points that are true, right? We believe that God is the author of history, of human history. God is the author, right? God created man, and God set the timeline in motion. Now, that doesn't mean everything that has happened that men and women have jacked up was God, but he did set the timeline into motion. He did create man. And the other thing is that God is the author of human history. And the TV's not working again this week, guys. That's a nice black TV. Hold on, I'm going to check the cord again. I purposefully do not do this. It came on? Hey, you guys are doing good. Anyone else want to get up here and help me? That would be great. Actually, I've learned when the TV messes up, it helps my head because I'm used to fixing things. So God is the author of human history. I already said that. And the next thing is that God is the main character in each story, whether you hear about God or not. Right? 2 weeks ago, Greg taught on Absalom, and there wasn't a lot of talk of God. But frankly, the absence of God was a lot of Absalom's issue. Last week we heard Ehud, and Ehud had God in his story. And today, there's going to be some level of God in each one of these stories. But God is the main character of each story. So we do have this timeline here, so we are all on the same page as to where we're at. Tree here is the Garden of Eden, right? Adam and Eve are created. Then these two tiles here are the Ten Commandments. So this is Moses, the crown is David, and Nehemiah is the wall, which Greg talked about a few weeks ago. We have the wall over there, the brick wall that we're all putting our names on. And then on the other side, right, of what we consider the New Testament, you've got the manger, the birth of Jesus, his death on the cross, and his resurrection, which again is why we are here. Everything we do is founded on the resurrection of Jesus. And then the church here is the church age. That's where we're living today. And then at the end is Jesus returning, which is at some point in the future. And I'd love to predict the date so I could be one of the many men in history, seems to be only men, that predict when that's going to happen and then prove wrong. But I'm not going to do that today. I might get more airtime on social media if I do, though. But I'm not going to do that. So this is the timeline that we are functioning in. And today, our focus is going to be, it doesn't matter what your history is, God can work it into his story. It doesn't matter what your history is, God can work it into his story. We're going to actually talk about two different women today. Last week I advertised that we were talking about two hookers, and I probably offended you, and I apologize for that. We are talking about two prostitutes. If that word feels better to you, great. We're talking about a real prostitute, and we're talking about a pretend prostitute, and we can learn a lot from them. We're talking today about Tamar and Rahab. Now, again, Greg spoke on Absalom a couple weeks ago, and he talked about a Tamar. This is actually two totally different women, same name, and we're talking about Rahab. So starting off with Tamar, Tamar comes before Moses. So we're getting a little older in the history here, and no, we purposefully did not put these all in order. So we're just jumping around the timeline in this series. We're going to start with Tamar, and in a little bit we're going to get to Rahab. But the idea that it doesn't matter what your history is, and God can work you into his story is what we're focusing on today. Last week I talked about how Ehud was a normal guy and how God uses normal, ordinary people to do his work in the world. And that's still true today. What we're going to look at today, though, is God also uses flawed people. Normally those ordinary people are flawed because guess what? They're ordinary. But flawed people are greatly used by God as well. Even looking at the timeline, Moses, right? Moses murdered an Egyptian guard in trying to protect his fellow Israelites. David slept with a married woman, got her pregnant, and killed her husband to cover her up for it. Jump into the New Testament, right? Jesus and his disciples, Peter, flawed guy. Jesus getting beaten right before he's crucified, and Peter's denying him 3 different times. Yeah, I don't even know the guy. Flawed individuals. Paul, right, who comes in between here after Jesus, before really, well, at the start of the church age, Paul murdered Christians because they believed in Jesus until he met Jesus. God uses flawed individuals to bring about his work in the world. And what it also shows us is that no story, nobody's story, I don't care what you've done, no story is beyond God's redemption. God can redeem all of our stories for his good. And that's what we're going to learn today. We're going to start off in Genesis chapter 38 and look at Tamar. Tamar comes onto the scene because of a man named Judah. Judah is the son of Jacob, who is the grandson of Abraham, as God founds his chosen people. And Judah moves away from his family to Adullam, hangs out with a friend named Hira, and has 3 sons. And his first son, it comes time for him to get a wife, and we join there in Genesis 38, verse 6, and it says, Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. I know I'm talking about how God can redeem every story, and I can't explain this one to you. Maybe had a chance. Maybe was just the biggest scumbag that ever lived. I don't know, and I can't explain it. And if we get hung up on everything in the scriptures that we can't explain, we're not going to accomplish anything in life, and we're going to get very little application. So we're going to leave in the ground where he is today and keep moving. Then Judah said to Onan, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. Let's keep going. But Onan knew that the child would not be his. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. Now that's a graphic verse. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that verse. But the reality is, in those days, their way was, right? Women were redeemed by they were provided for by the man in their lives. So if a man dies before he has a son, there's no inheritance coming to that daughter-in-law. There's nothing coming from Judah. When Judah dies, nothing. None of the farmland, none of the goats, the sheep, you name it. Nothing comes from Judah to Tamar because she's a woman. So the job of the younger brother is to give his brother a son, even though his brother's dead. So it would be Onan's job to get her pregnant, give her a son, and then through that son, she would get some inheritance. She would get provided for. So I'm real glad we don't do that today, but that is how it was back then. Let's keep going. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. These are some great guys. Moving on to verse 11. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's house, hold until my son Shelah grows up. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, and I'm reading the same verse again. Please throw the next group up. I'm doing great today, guys. I'm sorry. For he thought, he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. So Judah, like a lot of men, unfortunately, looks at this situation and says, wow, this woman's already killed 2 of my sons. I can't give her my 3rd son because there's no chance that he raised some very terrible sons. It's all Tamar's fault. So he just says, no. You go live with your dad. I'm not giving you my youngest. He's too young to give you a son, so he's a teenager, whatever he is. You go live at your dad's house, and when Shelah's old enough, he'll do his brotherly duty. So she heads back home, and surprise, surprise, even as Shelah gets older, Shelah, let's go with Shelah, gets older, Judah never sends him to pick up Tamar. So as the story unfolds, Tamar just sits there and waits and realizes, I'm not getting a husband. I'm not getting a firstborn son that can inherit anything. I've got to live at dad's house, basically as a hermit for the rest of my life. So as the story goes, Judah, his wife dies, and it says he mourns, right? And after that period of mourning, he then goes and with his friend Hira up to Timnah to shear the sheep, right? He's going up to see his sheep get taken care of, right? That's their big revenue source for the year. And on their way up there, this poor lonely man whose wife passed away, I don't think Judah's a poor man by any means, but this man, he comes upon a temple and he sees a prostitute sitting outside. And he gets an idea. And oh, by the way, Tamar had heard that he was going up to shear the sheep. So she dressed herself up to look like a prostitute. She covered herself in a veil so she could not be recognized, and she sat in front of the temple. And Judah comes up to acquire her services, and they negotiate a price. They agree upon the price. This is normally the point where the vice squad breaks into the room. And they agree that he's going to give her a baby goat. The price for what is going to go on is a baby goat, and he doesn't carry baby goats around in his back pocket. So he agrees to give her his staff, his cord, and his seal. That is a guarantee that he will have to bring her the baby goat. So they do what they do, and Judah heads on up to check on the sheep. And when he gets home later on, he sends Hero back with the baby goat. And surprise, surprise, there is no prostitute sitting in front of the temple, the shrine. And Hera asks around, hey, what happened to the shrine prostitute that was sitting here? And they looked at him like he had two heads, because there never was a shrine prostitute here. You must be crazy. And so Hera goes home, and Judah's confounded. I don't know what to do. I'm not going to go back up and ask more people, hey, what happened to the prostitute? Because that makes me look like a scumbag. And so he says, well, I guess she can keep the cord, the staff, and the seal as her payment, and he moves on with life. And 3 months later, he gets news. So let's jump back in verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law, Tamar, is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant. Because things happen when you do the things sometimes you do, right? And she is now pregnant. Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. That's a man of integrity and character, right? I mean, he's innocent and she's a terrible human being. Let's burn her. What a great way to die. Anyways, verse 24, moving on to 25. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant by the man who owns these, she said. And she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. Next verse. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah, and he did not sleep with her again. She's pregnant. She has twins, one by the name of Perez and the other Zerah. And Tamar gets her sons. You don't hear God at all in Tamar's story, other than in killing her husbands. You don't hear God in her story. Tamar took her future into her own hands. Tamar had a problem, and either she didn't know of Judah's God, or what she knew of him she didn't understand, or maybe she did, but she still chose to solve it on her own. She faced adversity, and she took it into her own hands, and she solved her own problem in the complete absence of God. And the sad part is, we don't hear about Tamar again. We'll hear her son's name again, but we're not going to hear Tamar's name again, because she solved her problems herself. She didn't bring God in her story. So let's jump forward about 500 years, and now we're going to look at Rahab. Now, Rahab is somewhat along the same lines of timeline that we talked about last week, right? We have Moses. Moses takes the children of Israel out of Egypt. They cross the Red Sea, and they come up to the Promised Land, and the children of Israel get scared based on the 10 spies, so they walk around for 40 years while God's waiting for them to die, which, again, what a sad story. And then they're dead, and the time has come for Joshua to take the children of Israel into the Promised Land. So before they even cross the Jordan River, Joshua sends 2 spies to look into what they're going to face when they get across the river and the first nation that they're going to confront. And he sends the spies, and the spies head into Jericho. They come into the city, they come through the gates, and the first place they go is they go into the prostitute's house, because it's not abnormal to see 2 random guys walk in from nowhere and going to a prostitute's house. And they go in and hide. But everyone in the city is afraid. They see the children of Israel coming, or at the very least, they've heard the children of Israel coming, and they've heard the stories of everything God had done for them. So they are scared. 2 spies come into their city, scares them. The king hears about it, and he sends his guards to look for these 2 guys. And of course, they know, or at least heard, that they went to Rahab's house. So he sends those guys his guards to Rahab's house to check on them, to see if they're there. And she says, no, they're not here. She hides them up on the roof under some flax stalks. They're not here. They left. You should go look for them down the road. So the guards leave. And they head out of the city searching for these two spies. And that's where we jump in Joshua chapter 2 and verse 6. It says, "Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, 'I know that the Lord has given you this land and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. And when you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed.' When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven and above and on the earth below. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death." A little bit different story there with the real prostitute, right? Rahab's fearful. She's heard what's going on. She's seen, right? They've seen the results of the children of Israel. They've moved across. They've heard the stories. And Rahab realizes death and destruction are ahead for my people. And she makes a decision different than Tamar, right? Instead of trying to solve things on her own, she reaches out to God. And so the spies the next morning, they say, "Okay, we'll protect you. We'll guarantee your life with our lives." So in other words, if something happens to you, we're going to die too. You let us out the window, we'll sneak off in the morning. And if you hang this scarlet cord, this red cord from your window, when we come back, we'll save you. And we'll save anyone and everyone that is in your house. So that family that you're wanting to save, you bring them into your house and they will be saved. But they've got to be in the house. So they sneak off, they head back, they go across the river, they meet up with Joshua and obviously share the story. So then Joshua leads the children of Israel across the river. Right? The Ark of the Covenant's the priests are the first ones that step into the water. The river dries up, the children of Israel cross. They pick up those big stones that they later that night put in Gilgal as a reminder, right, that Ehud's going to see later on. And then chapter 6, we see them actually heading for Jericho. And when they come to Jericho, Joshua pulls the spies out and says this. Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out, and all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her." So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother, her brothers and sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. So, children of Israel are coming up to the city. And God's telling them, all right, you're going to walk around that city, all of you, once a day for 6 days. And then, on the 7th day, you're going to walk around 7 times, and God's going to knock the walls down. And the children of Israel aren't doing anything to accomplish this, right? All they're doing is obeying God and walking around the city. They're going for a hike, and God's going to solve this. But God has told them, I'm going to take you into the promised land, and I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to give this to you. And it's a fascinating story, right? They go in, they rescue Rahab and her family, and they set them outside their camp. And the one thing God says to them, though, before they go into that city, before they start walking around is, hey, Jericho's mine. Whatever is in the city of Jericho is mine. Because one thing the children of Israel are going to get to do as they go through the promised land is they get the spoils of war. They get the animals, they get the gold, the silver, the iron, you name it. They get whatever they run into, whatever they find, and they get to keep it. Except with Jericho. God says, no, no, no. The first fruits of what you're going to see there, those are for me. God hasn't changed how he provides for his work in the world since the beginning. God expects, God's plan is for his people to give of their first fruits. Not because he needs it. And that idea of first fruits, right? The first battle, the first spoils of war, they're going to come to God. That's what God commanded. And the reason God does that is he wants to make sure everyone understands, his people understand, that you give me what's first, and that acknowledges that you're going to trust me to give you the rest of it. Right? They're going to conquer nation after nation, and they're going to collect all kinds of stuff. But the first city is for God. So what's in there is for God. And in the same way that Greg taught us a few months back now, that our first fruits, our tithe that we bring to God for his people is how he provides for his work in the world. It is fascinating. We see that happening even back long before they were walking around with Benjamins and Abraham Lincolns in their wallet. It's the way God provides for his work in the world. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. They gave God his first fruits. Rahab didn't die with everyone else. They burned the whole city. The walls fell down. Everyone died. The children of Israel didn't have to go in and kill anyone. And if you're sitting there saying, wow, that's terrible and violent, I agree. And I don't have to understand it. I'm just going to trust that it happened and thank God that Jesus came and paid for my failures, my shortcomings, and I'm not facing a wall falling down on me, unless I build a bad wall. We see that with Rahab. We see that with Joshua. The bottom line is, I missed a verse, guys. Let's throw up that last verse. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. Rahab trusted God. And she lives among the Israelites to this day, is what it said. Actually, we're going to hear a lot more about Rahab. This isn't the last time she's mentioned, right? You don't hear any more about Tamar, but you do hear about Rahab because Rahab trusted God. She heard about God. She heard about the destruction that was coming. She put her trust in that God, and she lived to tell the tale. It doesn't matter what your history is, God can work it into his story. We see that with Tamar. We see it with Rahab. The exciting thing we see with Rahab is not only do we see her in God's story, we're going to see God's story in her. So let's jump over to Matthew chapter 1. I know we got a lot of Bible today, but we're going to get through it. Matthew chapter 1, this is what's called the genealogy of Jesus. So if I ruin the surprise, I'm sorry. But Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah. Remember those names? Whose mother was Tamar. Tamar's still in the story. That's a picture of God's grace. Tamar did nothing to deserve to be in that story. It could have been Sheila's sons that passed on and were in the genealogy of Jesus, but it was Tamar. And in her sin, God still showed grace. She's still in the story. Let's keep going. Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. In the lineage of Jesus Christ, the Son of God who came to earth as a man to pay for my failures, my sins, my shortcomings, are a pretend prostitute and a real prostitute. Because Jesus came for all of us. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, that's another foreigner. That's a whole different conversation. But still, an awesome picture. You should read about Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. King David had these amazing women in his lineage, greatest king ever lived, right? And then if we jump all the way down to verse 16, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Tamar did nothing to deserve to be in that list, but she's there as a picture of God's grace. And I guess I lied. Her name is mentioned again. But not because of anything she did's the word. Not because of anything, but because of God's grace. But Rahab is there because of her faith in God. We can learn a lot from Rahab. Frankly, we can learn a lot from Tamar. But from Rahab, we're going to focus today, right? Both women were in God's story. But only Rahab had God in her story. Both women were in God's story, but only Rahab was in God's story, which begs the question, you are in God's story because you're in his church today. That puts you in his story. But is God in your story? You're here. You're in God's story. But is God in your story? We are incredibly welcoming, hopeful that skeptics show up. But as I said, right, the secret's out. We hope you don't stay skeptical. So if you're here this morning and God's not in your story, I beg you, I hope that as we go through these stories, as we hear what God has done, you realize that you want God in your story. Rahab was facing destruction. And she put her faith in God. If you're here today and you have not put your faith in God, there's no better day than today. For you to simply say, God, I believe Jesus came from heaven. He was born in the lineage there, right? It's got Tamar, Rahab, Ruth. He died on the cross as payment for my sin because he was innocent. And then he rose from the dead. I put my faith in that God. I have a hard time believing some of the stories that are told, but I do believe that Jesus did that. You don't have to believe everything. You have to believe that Jesus was God, that he paid for your sin, and he was risen from the dead. The resurrection of Jesus is the basis for everything that we do. That's how you change your future. That's how you change your family tree. The next thing we see about Rahab is Rahab prioritized putting God in her family story. Right? She said to the spies, I want you to rescue my mom, my dad, my brother, my sister, and all of theirs, which I assume is all of her nieces and nephews that she couldn't remember the name, right? She prioritized putting God in their story. So if you're sitting here and you're not skeptical, you've already put your faith and trust in Jesus. You're coming every week, you're coming every other week. However often you're here, you believe. But are you prioritizing putting God in the stories of your friends and family? How many people did you invite this week? How many people did you share your faith story with this week? How many people did you just be friendly to? Maybe we should start there. I spent a lot of years in Boston. I have a hard time just being friendly to people. I look mean. It's hard enough to even get someone to talk. Well, that sounded pathetic. How many people were you friendly to this week? I'm not great at it either. Jeff Van Gorder on the front row is incredibly good at it. Sorry to call you out on TV, Jeff. I'm not great at it, but I need to do it. Are you prioritizing inviting your friends and family? Are you prioritizing telling them about Jesus? Or just telling them about what Jesus did in your life? I know it's not always easy. For some of us that are shy, it's incredibly challenging, so we want to make things easier. So on July 7th, 4th of July weekend, we're having a cookout. We're actually having service in the parking lot. You're going to bring your lawn chairs. We're going to have one service at 10 o'clock on July 7th. We're going to have meat that the food crew is going to cook, the same guys who cooked the bacon yesterday with clean hands and gloves. And they're going to cook lunch that day. You're going to bring some sort of side or some sort of something sweet. We're going to have one service. We got a special speaker that I don't even know if I can tell you about him at this moment. And we're going to have a great day. There's going to be inflatables in the grass for the kids, probably some cornhole. and then we're going to shoot bows and arrows straight in the air and try and catch them. No, we're not going to do that part. But it's going to be a great day, an easy thing for you to invite your friends and your family to, because you don't want them to face the destruction that Rahab didn't want her family to face. You're going to prioritize. I hope you will prioritize. I know I am going to prioritize inviting. The last thing we look at, the last thing we see with Rahab, is actually talked about in James chapter 2. So in James chapter 2, if we can jump over there in verse 23, and the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham, you know Abraham, the foundation of God's chosen people, the father, believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. So you've got Abraham, the man of the greatest faith, the man that God chose to found his chosen people because of his faith. If we go on to verse 24, you see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. And then the same way was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them in a different direction. Rahab the prostitute is compared to Abraham, the man of such great faith. You see Rahab's story yet again, because Rahab trusted God, and then she took action. She didn't just have faith, she took action. Abraham didn't just have faith, he followed God, he took action. So what we see is that Rahab's faith drove her to take action. So then that begs the question is, does your faith drive you to take action? If not, why not? Last week, for those that were here, and if you weren't here, clearly you need to go home and watch it. I said you're sitting here, it's very likely there's something God's put in the back of your head, the front of your head, or screaming in your ear, not literally, that you need to do. Because God uses ordinary people like you and me to do his work in the world. There is likely something that God is wanting you to do, a conversation you need to have, a person you need to invite on July 7th, a relationship you need to repair, a relationship you need to get away from. Whatever it is, or putting your name on the brick wall, whatever it is, take action. It's great that you're sitting here, right? And if you have put your faith and trust in Jesus, we are glad you're here. We are glad you have faith. Now, demonstrate that faith by taking action. Do what Rahab did. That's our challenge to you today. Do what Rahab did. Take action. Demonstrate that you actually believe that God said what God said, and he's going to do what he said he's going to do. And if he wants you to do something, take action. Let's pray. God, we love you. We thank you that we have stories like Rahab and Tamar that we can learn from. God, today I beg you to help us all take the step, take the action that you'd have us to take so we can be Rahab and not Tamar. In Jesus' name, amen.